Hi, I'm Dan, and in this video we're going to use OpenID Connect as the authentication system for BookStack configured up to Azure Active Directory. Okay, to set the stage of what I have open and configured at the moment, right here I've got the OpenID Connect BookStack documentation, and this is going to be useful as we go through things, and I will be referring to this. I've also got my Azure login, and for reference I'm on the completely free Azure plan. I don't have anything added extra, I'm just using the basic Azure Active Directory. And here I've got a fairly typical BookStack instance where I'm already logged in as admin. Now one thing that it will be required, which I already have set up, is HTTPS support for your BookStack instance. So you can see here I'm on HTTPS psdemo.local, and this is a requirement to get OpenID Connect set up on Azure Active Directory. Your instance will need to be on HTTPS, which is a good thing to do anyway, but something to consider if you're trying to do this before you've made that step. And I'm also logged into my server where my BookStack instance is running, and this is a terminal window for that server. And I'm going to be doing all the config editing via the terminal window, but essentially all I'm going to be doing is editing a file. So you could do that however you prefer, whether that's either like SFTP or something like that. Now, a couple of extra things to consider with OpenID Connect authentication with BookStack is one, BookStack doesn't support any kind of logout mechanisms. There is a thing called OpenID Connect backchannel logout, but at this time, BookStack doesn't support that additional part of the standard. And secondly, BookStack doesn't support issuer discovery. So if you are hoping to integrate with multiple OpenID Connect identity providers, then that's not something that's currently supported. It's on a one BookStack to one Azure AD instance kind of configuration that we're doing things on. But with those items out of the way, let's get started. So we're going to start off going into Microsoft Azure, and I'll go into Azure Active Directory, and we're going to need to create our application instance. So we'll do that via going down here to application registrations, and in here you'll see I've already got some test ones set up from where I've done things in the past, but I'll go from scratch. So I'm going to go new registration, and I'm going to call this maybe BookStack OpenID Connect, and I'm just going to put in there video so I know which one we're doing in relation to the others that I've got testing. But in your case, I imagine just BookStack OpenID Connect will be fine. And then I'm going to leave this as default because I only want this within my current organizational directory. I'm not going to use this externally from this Azure AD instance. And then within the redirect URI down here, we do want to fill this in. So in here, I'm going to select web. And then for this box, I'm going to go back to my BookStack instance and copy out the URL. And so that's the base URL of our BookStack instance. And then I'm going to refer to the OpenID Connect authentication documentation within BookStack. And I'll scroll down to the section that's callback URL. And as it says here, you can use this URL endpoint. So I'm going to copy everything after the slash. So OIDC/callback, and paste that onto the end of our URL. So I've got our base BookStack URL, then /OIDC/callback. And then we'll go ahead and click on register. So with that application created, the next thing we want to do is give it the correct permissions to be able to work as an authentication platform for OpenID Connect. So next up, we'll go to API permissions and then add a permission. On the side here, we'll go Microsoft Graph and then delegated permissions. And then going down to the actual permissions down here, there should be an OpenID permissions section. And within this, we'll need email, OpenID and profile. So make sure all three of those are selected, and then we'll go add permissions. And then you should see those added to this section down here. So we've got email, OpenID and profile. So with that done, let's do a little bit of setup on the BookStack side. So going back to the documentation, we'll scroll up to where the main settings are, and I'm going to copy all of these, but only down to this section here where it ends with OpenID issuer discoverer. Because we will be using OpenID Discovery just to automatically fill some of the settings, which you can manually define by using these settings down here. But it's easier if we just let Microsoft manage those and we automatically fetch those on the BookStack side. I'm going to copy these to my clipboard, and I'm going to jump back to my terminal. Within here, I'm going to go to my BookStack instance directory, which is cd var www and BookStack. And I'm going to edit the .env file. So here's all the BookStack settings in my env file. And I'm going to jump down to the bottom of here and let's paste those in. And I'll review what we've got here. So this option here activates the authentication method of OpenID Connect. By default, this is standard, but let's leave it as OpenID Connect because that's what we want. Then auth auto initiate Now this is a cool setting that will automatically trigger the OpenID Connect login process just to provide a more seamless login experience. I'm going to leave that false for now. Down here is the name that we want to show for the login button. So this is how it displays to users on the BookStack side. I'm going to instead choose some quotes, we can use spaces. Let's just name the single sign-on. And next up is the claim that we want to use for the display name within BookStack. Now typically this can just be name. We might want to change that, but we'll have a look at what claims we have available in a moment. And now the client ID setting. I'm going to remove this default, and then we can jump back to Azure AD to find this client ID. So back in here, I'm going to go back to overview for this application registration. Then in here, we have application client ID. I'm going to copy that out and jump back, and I can paste that in. And now client secret. Again, I'll remove what's in there by default, and we're going to have to get this from Azure again. So we'll jump over. And this is in a bit of a different location because it's a secret detail. So we want to go down to certificates and secrets on the sidebar, and then client secrets here in the tabs, and then click new client secret. You can just put in here OIDC secret. And these do expire, at least by default. I think you could set a really long custom range, but whatever you configure, remember to put that date in the calendar somewhere just so you can refresh this secret value so you don't get caught out. But I'll leave it as the default here because this is just a demo. And I'll hit add, and then down here, you'll see your new secret added, and then you can copy this to the clipboard. Beware, this is the only time that you'll see this value. If you miss this at all, what you'd have to do is delete this and click new secret, and then go through that process again just to create one from scratch. But I'll copy this value, I'll jump back. What I'm going to do, just because this can contain special characters, I'm going to wrap this in quotes, and then I'll paste that in like so. So that's our client ID and client secret setup. Next up is this OIDC issuer. So again, I'll remove what's in there by default. As it says here, it must start with HTTPS. And again, this is a detail that we'll find in Azure. So we'll jump back across. We'll go back onto the overview page, and we'll click on endpoints. And then we see a whole bunch of endpoints here. And there's one for OpenID Connect metadata document. If we copy that and then go to that in the browser, then this will return a bunch of data. And this is what BookStack uses in the background for its auto discovery. But within this, we can find the issuer. And keep in mind, this is formatted because Firefox is formatting this quite nicely. You might see this as raw JSON data like this, in which case you'll have to kind of find the detail within here. But what we're looking for is in the issuer URL here. So this URL, which if you don't want to go through that JSON, it should be that URL that you went to, but just without the /.well-known and everything beyond that part. So essentially just that. I'm going to copy this, go back to our config, and I'll paste that in there. And again, for safety, I'm just going to wrap that in quotes. And then we have this OIDC issuer discover, and we want to leave that as true. Because as we said earlier, BookStack will fetch any additional details from Azure itself. Now that's all the base configuration done. Let's save this and see if it's all working. So I'll save this file. I'll jump back into the browser, go to my instance where I'm currently logged in as an admin account. What I'm going to do, just because I'm going to log in under a different account, I want to keep logged in to admin here. And also I'm going to use a different Microsoft account, and that might log me out of Azure. So I'm going to open a new different type of tab. And within that, I'm going to go to my BookStack instance. And this is using Firefox's tab containers, but it's the same thing. You could just use like a private window or something if you wanted to test it with a different account. But now we're looking at the login page, and we can see something's changed. We don't have the usual username and email login. We've got this login with single sign-on. Let's click that. Okay, so it's taken us to Microsoft, and it's now showing that application name. And within the settings, you can play around, and there's ways to like set an image, I think, and you can tweak the name to make it a bit more presentable to users. But this is fine for my cases, and it's asking us permissions as a normal application login might look like. I'm going to say, yep, that's all good. Cool, and we're sent back to BookStack. We're logged in, and I did use this account for Barry, because that's who I'm currently logged in under this tab container on the Microsoft side of things. If I go to my profile, we can see it's pulled in a name across Barry test user, and it's brought in my email, which is azurebarry@danb.me. In regards to the avatar here, the BookStack OpenID Connect integration doesn't really do anything with avatars at all. So this is just being brought back from Gravatar. But otherwise, that looks like it's currently working. But I want to go a step further and set up group syncing. So as I log into BookStack, it will match up my groups in Azure to a role in BookStack. And that way it provides a nice easy way to kind of manage permissions across the systems without having to do manual work within BookStack. But I'm not currently sure if Azure is providing any group data. So what we're going to do, we're going to do a bit of debugging. And I want to show you this process specifically because it can be really useful to understand exactly what's going on in this sync and be able to delve into the details that are going across between the systems. So back to the BookStack documentation, I'm going to scroll down and there's a section down here called debugging. It's got this option here of dump user details. I'm going to copy this, then jump back to my terminal window where I can edit my .env file, and I'm going to append that to the bottom, and I'm going to change this value to true, and then I'll save this file. And we'll see how this works in a second. If I go back to my instance, I'll log out as Barry, I'll log back in, and now we can see all the details that are coming back on the ID token that Azure provides. So these are all the details that BookStack will pick out to create or log someone in as a user. So we can see the email claim and the name claim being used here. And that name claim is configurable. So if we instead wanted to use this preferred username, which doesn't look preferred to me, but say we did wanted to use that, just as an example, within the config where we had this OIDC display name claims, I could instead change that from name to preferred username. And then this detail would be picked out instead of Barry test user. But one thing that I noticed within here is that there's currently no group data. There's nothing telling me what Azure groups that Barry here is a part of. Whereas if I go into Azure and I'll go to Active Directory and I go to users, I click on Barry and I look at their groups, we can see they are part of this wizards group. And right now within that dumps data, I don't see any of that within here. So let's look how we can add that bit of extra detail onto this ID token so BookStack can use it. Within Azure Active Directory, if we go back and then find our application registration, and on the sidebar again, if we go to token configuration, and then we got some options here. We can add optional claims, and this can be quite useful. So if I click ID token, because that's what BookStack uses, you've got a whole bunch of other details that you might want to pull through. Say again, if you wanted to use the given name or family name for that user, you can pull that across and put that in the ID token to use. But that's not what we want to do right now. We want to add group data. So I'm going to click add groups claim, and then I'm going to click security groups because that's how I'm managing groups in Azure Active Directory. Again, it's going to depend how you've got things set up. And then I can expand ID down here. So that's the type of token used by BookStack. And I can see it's going to use the group ID. So we should expect the group's unique ID from Azure Active Directory to be provided with this token now. So I'm going to hit add. And we can see that's been added here. And then with most things in Active Directory, it might be wise just to give it a minute or two just for these settings to apply. But once we've given it a moment, we can go back, and I'm going to go back in the browser here. So this is where we dumped out our details, but I'm going to go back in the browser. So we're back to login page, and I'll hit sign in again just to go through the process again. And now we've dumped out the details again because we've still got that option enabled. But here we see groups, which we didn't have before. It's got groups and then 0 and then some stuff here. So here we can see this starts with 273B. And if I go back into Azure Active Directory, I'll go back to find Barry again. I'll look at his groups and we can see that wizard group starts with 273B as well. So it's this ID that's being put into this data. So BookStack is now able to use that to map up to roles within the system. But before it does, it needs to be configured. So let's start that process. If we go to the documentation for BookStack again, and we'll scroll down to this group sync section, and a lot of here is a lot of detail about how the mapping occurs, which is worth reading. But I'm going to skip over that and go straight to the configuration that we need. And I'll copy all of this in, and again, jump over to our .env file, and I'll paste all of this in. And while I'm here, I'm going to change this setting back. So this dump user details back to false so we can allow normal login again. But in terms of what we pasted in, so this first option, OIDC user to groups, enables or disables the group sync entirely. So we're going to leave that as true because we want to now have it enabled. And this one, set the attribute for which the BookStack will read group names from. So if we go back to look at that dumps data, we can see that as under groups. And if we have a look at that as raw JSON, we'll pretty print that. You see it's groups and then there's an array of these IDs. And that's exactly what BookStack expects. And we don't actually need to change that because it's on the groups claim. But if that was named something different, we might need to. But Azure does that in just groups. We can leave that as is. OpenID connect additional scopes. Now this we don't actually need because we didn't have this setting and Azure is already providing the group data. what I'm actually going to do is just comment this setting out with a hash in front of that, because leaving that active could cause more problems, so I'd rather leave that out. And then right at the bottom here, we have this remove from groups. So whether you want this enabled really depends on how you want to manage roles within BookStack. By having this set as true, BookStack will automatically remove all the roles of a user before it resyncs them with Azure, which can be really handy in most cases if you've got everything mapped up nicely and you don't need to do additional management. But if you do want to ever do manual role assignments within BookStack, you might want to set this to false, because otherwise anything you manually change within BookStack may be overwritten the next time this user logs in and their roles get synced up. But in my case, I think I'm going to leave this as true. And something to consider when this is enabled as true, as it states here in this little note, when this is true and these roles are synced when a user logs in, the user will also be given the default registration role within the BookStack settings. So if we have a look at that, so I'm still logged in as an admin on this browser tab. I'll go to settings, registration, and then the default user role after registration. It's currently set to none, but if we wanted to always give users one role by default, we can select a role here. So if we wanted everyone to be maybe a viewer by default, we can use that and save. And then they would also be given anything they sync with. It's just a nice way to give them some maybe baseline roles or permissions, even if they don't match up with anything within Azure. But I'll leave that as none. And just to confirm on that as well, you don't need to enable registration for that system to work. This setting will be used regardless. So that's everything done on the config side. So I'll save this file and then I'll jump back. And then I'll go to that tab where we're logging in as our test user. I'll go back to login page and refresh, and then I'll hit the login again. And we can see everything's still working, we're being signed in. But if I go to my admin tab and have a look at this user account, we can now see this external authentication ID here. Now this only shows up when you have a non-standard authentication method configured, like we do for OpenID Connect. And this is only something shown to admin users within the system. But this shows the user's unique ID from, in this case, Azure, at least what Azure is providing. So if we wanted to manually map someone up that was already within BookStack, for instance, we could come to their user account within BookStack and enter their unique ID within here. So something to consider is that by default, Azure Active Directory provides a user ID that is unique per user per application, as in the application that we registered on Azure Active Directory. So it's not their unique user ID generally in Azure Active Directory. And this can be problematic in a few areas, like if you did have a bunch of users within your BookStack instance and you wanted to pre-fill this value manually, it's hard to pre-predict this value, whereas you could find their unique ID much easier. And if you do run into that scenario, what you can do is that within our BookStack documentation, there's a section on using a different ID claim. And it says in here, kind of by default, BookStack will follow the standard for OpenID Connect and use the subclaim. But Azure Active Directory will provide another claim called the UPN, which is that user's general ID within Azure Active Directory. So you can basically set that setting and then as standard use the user's unique Azure Active Directory ID rather than their per application per user ID. Sorry, a bit of a tangent, but back onto roles now. We can see this user currently doesn't have any roles at all. So while we could log in fine, we're not seeing any current active group syncing. What we need to do is map the groups that we have in Azure Active Directory with the roles that we have in BookStack. So we'll go through an example of doing that. If I go to roles, and then we'll go to editor. And again, we have an extra box here when we have OpenID Connect active, the external authentication IDs box. And if you remember earlier, we saw the unique group ID provided within the user's group data. We can use that here. So if I go back to Azure Active Directory and I'll go to that wizards group and I'll copy this object ID because that's the ID that we saw, and I'll paste that within this box here. And it is detailed within the BookStack documentation, but it is possible if you needed to map multiple Azure groups to a single BookStack role. But for now, I'm just going to map this one editor role within BookStack to the wizards group within Azure Active Directory. So with that put in, I'll go down and save this role. And then back in my other tab, where I'm logged in as Barry, I'll log out again. I'll log back in with single sign-on. So we're in here now. We're seeing a bit more, which is a good sign. But if I go back to my admin tab, and then look at Barry, we can see they now have that editor role assigned. So upon login, that group sync process has run successfully and has mapped them, because they were a wizard, it's mapped them to the editor role within BookStack. So everything is working rather well. One last thing that I want to show is that auto initiate process. If I go back to my .env file where we saw that option, and I'll go right back up to where it was. So yeah, auto initiate. If we now set this to true, and I'll save that. We'll go back to the browser and I'll log out And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy the URL to the homepage for my BookStack instance. And I'm going to go to that directly as if I was maybe going through from a link or something like that. And you'll see there was a bit of a loading screen there, but we didn't have to click login. BookStack recognized it was on the login page and realized that that option was active and that OIDC was in use. So it essentially presses the button for us to provide a much more seamless process. So just one extra step less for the user to do. So it's usually worthwhile toggling that on as a quick win. Note that that system won't work if you have any extra authentication systems enabled. So if you have like the sign in with Google system added or any of the third-party authentication providers outside of just OpenID Connect that we've just set up, then that system won't start. But yeah, that's everything set up and everything working and configured. One question that sometimes comes up is how do I limit users that are able to access BookStack at all? And there's nothing specific on the BookStack side to filter access or prevent users accessing the system. The idea from kind of BookStack's perspective is that anyone using that authentication system should be allowed to access BookStack. What you could do is maybe use roles. So by default, kind of like we had earlier, give users no permissions at all unless they map up with a role, and therefore maybe they could access the system but not have visibility to any of the data within the platform. Alternatively, and this is I think the more standard way about approaching this with single sign-on systems like OpenID Connect, you can do this on the Azure side of things. So if I go back to Active Directory, and then this time we go to Enterprise Applications, and we can see within this list, even though we didn't go to application registrations, it was a different menu, but we do have our original application here, BookStack OIDC. And then within here, we do have some additional options in terms of how this is used within our environment. So if we go to properties here, there's a few options like enabled for users to sign in and then assignment required. So I haven't gone in depth in testing this, but what I believe you can do is, turn that on, and then go to users and groups in the sidebar here and then assign users and groups specifically to this application. And as it states here, because I'm on the cheapo Active Directory free plan, I can only do that on a per user basis, which can be a bit of a hindrance if you haven't paid up for the additional Active Directory license. But generally, I think these systems on the Azure Active Directory side can allow fairly dynamic and complex management of who can access through that authentication method to then initially get access to BookStack at all. So yeah, just mentioning this because that question comes up here and there, and it might be something that you need. So that's everything that I've got to run through. So I do recommend reading through the documentation that we have on our website, just so you're aware of any of the little details which I failed to mention during this video. But hopefully this has given you a really good oversight, at least the core fundamental steps required to set this up, at least unless Microsoft have completely changed the Azure interface. If you do need help on this, there are a few avenues, as can be seen on our support page. There's the free community support options where I try to check in on a daily basis and help people out there. Otherwise, there are some enterprise support options available that provide high priority responses, while the purchase of these also helps sustain the BookStack project. But that's everything for this video, so I hope your integration goes smoothly and have a wonderful day.